The year is 2025, and I think that Devil May Cry 1 is still an underrated game, and not only that, I think it's a misunderstood game by a lot of people, at least in terms of where it is considered in its own genre and its own series. I think in this era of everyone wanting a remake, I really don't want to hear any more morons talking about remakes for classic games. We do not need a DMC1 remake. We certainly do not need a Devil May Cry 3 remake the way that Resident Evil 4 got the treatment, and that goes for other games in the series as well. What we need to have more than ever is we need to have more unique games, and a game like Devil May Cry 1 from 2001, it is what we need exactly. It is so unique compared to the games that came after it, and that's in spite of it being also the blueprint for an entire generation of games, not only in its genre, but in multiple genres that have crossed over. You think of the infamous Dark Soul with Light, the very sort of unintentionally comical moment at the end of the game. That's really not only I'm being a little facetious here. I would think that that's where the name Dark Souls came from. Probably not literally, but of course the gameplay inspired everything about the Souls games, and the Souls games still can't measure up to true character action games. But I really think the Devil May Cry 1 is actually more of a horror game. And obviously, anyone with that's read the Cliff Notes version of the lore behind Devil May Cry 1 would know that it started out as a Resident Evil successor by the great Hideki Kamiya-san, who had just finished directing Resident Evil 2. And Shinji Mikami encouraged him to follow his own passions and trust his instinct and develop something that was a little bit different. In his words, he wanted to make the first cool game ever made, and maybe it's not the first cool game ever made, but it might be the first game ever made around that concept. And Dante is very cool, even in the first game. I think that he isn't the cliche at this point, sort of a cliche, the wacky woohoo pizza man. I think Dante's a lot more than that in every game. He's always been more than that. But he's still a pretty badass character, very interesting character. Understanding the concept of a character that doesn't take up too much screen presence with dialogue and antics. He's really a character that you get to know through the gameplay, which is why I think Devil May Cry is the best series, one of the best series, one of the very, very top games ever made, any one of them, except for maybe the pretty bad sequel that is Devil May Cry 2. But going back to play Devil May Cry 1, I got the platinum on it, and this is a game that I played when I was a kid, but I didn't get into it the same way I did with 3 and 4. But I always liked it, I always admired it, and many years later, and a few years ago, I beat it for the first time. When I was a kid, I only got through a couple of missions, and today, I'm playing the game again. To say that I've gotten all of the games platinum, because I was a big fan of 3, 4, and 5, but not so much 1 or 2. And the atmosphere holds up so well. Again, compared to the Souls games, people talk about Bloodborne, and I'll be doing a retrospective on that soon. But compared to something like Bloodborne that has a similar kind of horror style, some would say like gothic style, I don't think that's exactly what they're going for here. I think that's just a misnomer. But when you consider that Bloodborne is really just a plagiarism of Lovecraft lore, Devil May Cry 1, again, one of the most original games ever made, not only for its gameplay, but there isn't anything that looks quite like Devil May Cry 1, and not in the 3D atmosphere, 3D space. When you're exploring the castle, which I think very much like Devil May Cry 3, the castle is very much a character part of the setting, but also a character in and of itself, which I think justifies a little bit of the backtracking in these games, that you go back through some of the same areas, but with slightly different alterations, and you really see that here in DMC1, where you're going back through the castle in the second half of the game, and it's very dark and scary, and you're not quite sure where to go because things are a little bit rearranged. And there's a lot of puzzles, a heavy emphasis on puzzles in Devil May Cry 1, and almost completely incoherent until you figure out the right order, and then the game is very smooth. It's a very fast-paced game, a very short game, high replay value. The difficulty settings, again, Devil May Cry is a master of difficulty settings and introducing new obstacles to you that you've never seen before in some cases on higher difficulty. So it's like not just playing a harder version of the same game, you have to completely relearn boss fights and encounters, some of which are altered completely. It's just one of the greatest horror games ever made. The sounds and the use of color and the unique environments and the enemies. I love the themes of the game when you first come to the island, and the first enemy that you encounter is the puppet, and everything is, all of the enemies, all of the characters are under the sway of this legendary demon emperor Mundus, who's kind of the author of everything that's gone wrong in the series up to this point. He's always the one behind the curtain. He's this shadowy figure, and very, very unique iconography. He's got the three red lightning eyes, and he's always far off in the distance. He's in some void, and he's always luring people in. And he's got control of Trish, and he's got control of Nilo Angelo, that we all know is Dante's brother, that he's long lost. And the puppets are kind of emblematic of the sway that this mysterious villain has over everything. He's the mastermind behind it all. And you have these great bosses, very few bosses, but you fight them multiple times, and the fights get harder each time. There's a progression of the themes, there's a progression of the mechanics, and then you finally, it's so memorable, each encounter, and then there's a stepping stone to the next one, and then you fight off against Mundus, which is such a novel encounter in this game, or in any game. You fight him in this giant void. It's dark, and it's very creepy and very beautiful at the same time. When you come to his palace, it looks completely unlike anything else in the game. I love that in these games, when you go to the underworld, it often looks very heavenly, like in Devil May Cry 3 Mission 18. So you go to Mundus's palace, it's very beautiful, it's very exquisite, elegant, and then but he's a monster, and then you fight this giant monster. He looks like what you would imagine God would look like, and then but he's the devil. And a two-phase boss fight is kind of unheard of, I think, at this time in a game. You have two health bars you have to take out, and two completely different dynamics going on. He's a very intimidating boss, but he's one of the best bosses, I think, in the series and in any game. I think he's just so unique of a boss, and really lives up to his reputation. And the storyline and the ending is quite poetic as well. It kind of makes me a little emotional, actually, even though it's a little people make fun of how comic it is with the fill your dark soul with light, but I think Trish becoming an ally and a friend to Dante, and the symbolism and the sentiment of Trish being designed as a monster to lure Dante to Mundus, and then she's the first character in the series, or at least not chronologically, but of the first game, to have the devils never cry, get that speech from Dante to show emotion when she's not supposed to. You think about, I think that's actually a really good storyline. And I think the characterization of Dante, Drew Coombs, I believe, is the voice actor for the original Dante, did a fantastic job. Ruben Langdon obviously would come along, and the other actors would be incredible in the parts that they played, but the original voice actors did a really good job too. And what I love about these games is they were always in English. They were English only voice acting, and then later the Japanese would have a dub. Japanese language is really the dub. These characters were made to be sort of westernized, and it's amazing. You think about how complex the gameplay is, how complex the enemies are. You have all of the enemy files, and the enemies each have these unique weaknesses that you can exploit at the right time. You can get the critical kills on all of them. There's a lot of things that would be improved in Devil May Cry 3 and the other games, but Hideki Kamiya set out to make a game that had a unique identity, and that's what we need more of. So I don't want to hear more about, Devil May Cry 1 needs a remake so it can play more like Devil May Cry 3 or play like 4 or 5. No. Of course, there's more depth and variety in 3 and 4 and 5, but those are games that were made many years later with different design philosophies. Devil May Cry 1 was really trying to be, I think, more of a horror game, and it is the best game in the series at getting that across. Not to say that the other games don't have great atmosphere as well, but you play Devil May Cry 1, it has a confidence in itself, and it has this unique identity that you're not going to find in many other games. It's the same, as I've said, why people like something like Bloodborne or other games of that nature. People like that aesthetic, that kind of aesthetic, and people like the uniqueness, and that's why From Software does deserve some credit for the unique games that they've made. Even though they share similarities, they do copy themselves a bit. They've got to a point where one game is different to the next, and we need to have, even within a genre, a single genre, you want to have games that are unique from one to the next. So the homogeneity needs to go. I think Devil May Cry 1 is still an excellent game to play, and it's a really inspiring game for a game from 2001. Holds up very well today. So many amazing gameplay features, and just the mood and the tone of the game. It's a classic for sure. So I just want to say that Devil May Cry 1, the difficulty, everything about the difficulty, it holds up as a very challenging game, very complex game. Not in terms so much of combos this and combos that, but needing to strategize and really learn every enemy and every boss. And again, the dynamic evolves as you go from one stage to the next, even one mission to the next. And the pacing is just, it's incredible pacing. It's a very short game if you know what you're doing, but it's a very intense experience. So Devil May Cry 1, I want to say, very underrated even by me. I always admired this game, but didn't know it was really this great, and it holds up as well. It's one of the best first games ever made, and not just for the series, but for the genre. It's still one of the most important games ever made. And instead of remaking the game, I would encourage people just to go back and play it again in its true state as it was intended, and do that with all of the classics.